The Ancient Wolf Queen, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The ice cracks. The glacier groaned. Somewhere deep in the north, in the old lands forgotten by all but ghosts and madmen, the ice split like ancient bone. A hairline fracture. Then another. Cracks stitched across the white world in quiet agony, too slow for the eye, too deliberate for nature. For centuries the crying mountain had held its secret. Now it began to let go. Beneath the shroud of ice, her body stirred. A twitch of fingers frozen in ritual stillness. Nails like glass. A pulse returned, faint but defiant. Her heart, untouched by time, began to remember its rhythm. The first breath scraped her lungs like gravel. She gasped. It echoed in the hollow beneath the glacier like a scream, swallowed whole. The world above didn't notice, not yet. But in the lowlands, where trees still grew and wolves still fought for scraps of sovereignty, one man raised his head as the wind shifted. Anthony Black, Alpha of the Black Fangs, turned his gaze toward the north. His wolf, Ryek, stirred like a shadow across his spine, restless in his silence. The moon was wrong tonight, hung too low, lit too red. He tasted metal on the wind and didn't know yet that it was prophecy. The others slept, snoring beneath stretched hides in the comfort of warm breath. Anthony remained seated against a crooked pine, blade in hand, sharpening more from habit than need. The wind snapped through the trees with a hiss, and somewhere far off the old howling began again, thin, cold, older than pack song. His hand stilled on the blade. That wasn't just wind. That was a call. Not a summons. A return. She was awake. Deep beneath the cracked mountain, Isara's bones ached as though fire threaded through them. Her eyes opened into darkness so thick it suffocated thought. She didn't move at first. She listened. No voices, no wolves, and not even Alira, her other self, stirred. The silence was almost enough to crush her again. She rose with the sound of stone grinding against stone. The tomb, sealed in ceremonial frost, fractured with every step she took. Ice clung to her lashes, her hair. Her bare feet sank into snow that had never seen sun. Her limbs burned. Her skin, though unmarred, felt new and raw, as though she'd been born again, or peeled out of death. She didn't remember dying, only betrayal. The throne room bathed in moonlight, the silver-clad courtiers kneeling as the blade pierced her from behind. Her sister's voice, her cousin's sneer, then cold. Now. This. The mountain opened its belly with a groan as she emerged, naked and steaming against the snow. Her hair fell in tangled ropes down her back, white as the frost she'd shattered. Her breath smoked in the air. Her silver eyes narrowed at the world laid before her. Trees like black spears. Sky like old blood. The empire was gone. She could feel it in the stillness. What remained would be rotten, broken, ruled by scavengers and bastards. She began to walk, not toward it, but through it. Anthony heard the whispers before the scout returned, panting, breathless, wild-eyed. There's something walking the ridge, alone, not human, not wolf. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need stories. His instincts pulled tight across his chest like a net ready to snap. He mounted without speaking and rode north. He found her 2 days later, barefoot and blood-smeared from some unfortunate creature that had crossed her path. She stood at the edge of a frozen lake, staring down at her reflection like it might speak first. He dismounted quietly, but she turned before he reached her. She didn't startle. She didn't speak. She simply watched him, as if she already knew what he was, or what he wanted. Anthony wasn't a man who stumbled over his thoughts, but something about her, God's. She was tall, even without shoes, made his chest tighten with a sharp, unfamiliar heat. You're the one they're whispering about, he said finally. The queen beneath the ice. Her head tilted slowly. She blinked like she was still relearning the motion. I thought you'd be older, he added, not sure why. She took one step toward him. No shift, no threat, just presence. Her skin glowed faintly in the dusk, marbled like cold marble kissed by light. Her voice, when it came, was softer than he expected, low and clean, like a blade drawn in silence. "You're in my way?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That depends on where you're going." "I'm not going, I'm returning." Their wolves pushed against the surface at the same time. Reich snarled beneath his skin, teeth bared in instinctive challenge. But she didn't even blink. Her wolf, Alira, though Anthony couldn't know her name, pressed forward like a queen surveying a lesser beast. The moment cracked like flint. He took a step forward and she didn't retreat. The distance between them closed like a trap. He didn't touch her. Not yet. But the thought was there, humming in his blood. Her scent was wild, snow and ash, something holy, something feral. Not the sweetness of a young she-wolf, not the desperation of an omega. She smelled like a crown never yielded. "Help me bring down the king," he said. She laughed, a low sound, bitter, beautiful. "You're not the first to ask. Are you always this warm?" "I've been cold a long time." Their eyes locked. Something ancient passed between them. Not promise, not yet, but possibility. It sparked in the silence. It simmered beneath skin. Anthony didn't look away, neither did she. In the quiet, a storm began. Chapter 2. The rogue alpha. The wind chased them down the mountain like a living thing. It dragged at Isara's hair, pulled at Anthony's cloak, slipped between their movements like a question neither of them was ready to ask. The trees thinned as they descended, the snow melting to mud under their steps, the cold traded for wet and shadowed green. Still, neither of them spoke. Words were not the currency either of them trusted yet. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not with caution but with calculation. She moved like someone who had never been told no. Her body was lean and tall, shaped by ancient combat, not vanity. Even barefoot, she kept perfect balance on the uneven terrain, silent as if the earth itself remembered her tread. The snow had melted off her skin hours ago, but the memory of it lingered. So pale, she looked like something carved from moonlight and left to thaw. Her expression never shifted. She didn't seem curious. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't glance at him once, and yet she stayed close. Anthony led her through the edge of the southern forest toward a makeshift camp, hidden between jagged hills and black pine. The others would wait. His wolves knew not to question the scent of dominance laced with something older, stranger. They had felt the pressure in the air when he'd returned with her trailing behind him, like a shadow carved from snow and silver. He didn't bring her into the center of camp. He didn't let anyone else near her. Instead, he gave her shelter in the burned-out chapel just above the cliffs, long abandoned by whatever gods had once tolerated wolves in their walls. He watched her step into it without hesitation, as if she belonged there more than he ever had. She didn't sleep that night, neither did he. She sat on the floor, spine straight against the stone, eyes reflecting firelight like polished steel. He leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed over his chest, pretending he didn't feel her in every breath he took. Her scent clung to the air, clean, cold, the wild edge of something about to change shape. Rake was restless beneath his skin, not with aggression but something worse. Want, the kind that lived in the blood, in the old parts of the wolf. It was dangerous. Not because she was queen or powerful or even mysterious, but because she did not seem to care about any of it. He couldn't read her, and Anthony had made his life out of reading wolves before they struck. When morning came, she stood and walked to him without a word. Her hair, tangled and unbrushed, flowed over her shoulder like silk pulled from winter. Her skin had no right to be that flawless after centuries of death, and yet it held no softness. She was carved for war, for thrones, for wolves who bowed without understanding why. "You don't belong here," he said, not meaning it the way it sounded. She studied him for a moment. silver eyes flicking over his mouth, his shoulders, then lower. The corner of her lip twitched. Not a smile, not quite, but something close enough to leave heat crawling under his collar. "I'm not staying," she replied, voice softer than it should have been. "This isn't mine." "Then what is?" She didn't answer. She turned instead, walking out toward the cliffside, the sun spilling across her bare back, catching the silver-white strands of her hair like a flag he hadn't earned the right to touch. He followed without thinking. The view from the cliffs opened wide. Endless trees, far-off smoke trails from distant packs, the ruins of an empire buried beneath roots and rot. She stared at it like a queen assessing her inheritance, but her hands were still empty. He stepped beside her, close enough to feel her heat. "We're going south," he said, eyes on the horizon, toward the capital. "You'll die," she said, not unkindly. "I'll take the king with me." Her gaze turned to him at last. A long, deliberate look. Not surprise, not challenge, just consideration, as if she were trying to measure the truth of him from the weight of his voice. "Then you're a fool," she said. "And you're not?" She looked back at the forest. "I was," she said after a pause. "Once." Silence stretched between them like a thread drawn too tight. He didn't ask about her past. He wouldn't beg for her story. If she wanted him to know, she'd give it freely. Until then, he could only study her posture, the way her shoulders stayed stiff even when she was still, the way her hands curled like claws when she was thinking. He wondered how her hands would feel at his throat. The thought came unbidden, it didn't leave, and she turned away first. That night she moved through the camp like a shadow without a purpose. Wolves stopped and stared. No one dared approach. Her presence crackled, ancient and untouched by their customs. Anthony watched her from the ridge above, arms folded, Reich pacing beneath his skin like a thing waiting to pounce. She paused once near the training circle and picked up a blade from the weapon rack. The movement was elegant, lazy. She tested the weight of it in one hand, then spun it in a slow arc through the air that made the younger wolves watching flinch. Anthony came down before she could speak. He didn't announce himself. She didn't turn. But when he stepped close enough to brush her shoulder with his breath, she stilled. Slowly, she turned toward him. The firelight made her eyes shimmer like polished frost. "You're watching me," she said. "I'd be stupid not to." "Are you afraid?" He leaned in, just enough, close enough to feel the heat roll off her skin. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her mouth was half a breath from his. "No," he said quietly. Then she smiled, not wide, not warm. A flicker, a threat, a dare. She stepped past him without a word, blade still in her hand. And as she disappeared into the trees, he felt the gravity of her pull like a star collapsing in on itself. He didn't follow, but he wanted to. Chapter 3. Of Blood and Bone. The road wound south through the ruins of what had once been the heart of the Wolf Empire. Trees grew through cracked marble pillars, and vines hung from the ribs of fallen statues that still carried the faint outlines of wolves with crowns. Isara walked ahead of Anthony, her stride long and unbroken, the hem of her borrowed cloak brushing through the dust of her past. She had spoken little since the mountain, but her silence was not the silence of confusion. It was deliberation. She was remembering, and every step was a reclamation of something lost. Anthony followed, his gaze fixed not on the path but on her. He told himself it was because she was unpredictable, dangerous, possibly unstable after centuries of slumber. But that wasn't the truth. He watched because there was something in the way she moved that made the air around her feel alive. She carried herself as though she were born of the elements themselves, shaped by ice and tempered by moonlight. And though he had stood in the presence of queens before, alphas who called themselves rulers, none had ever made him feel the edge of reverence. They stopped at the ruins of an old bridge as the sun dipped low, bleeding through the forest in copper tones. The air smelled of moss and rusted stone. Isara paused in the middle of the crumbling archway, her hand resting against a column carved with faded wolf sigils. Anthony approached her slowly, his boots scattering shards of gravel. "You've been here before," he said quietly. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes traced the carvings with a strange detachment, as though seeing ghosts of her own making. "It was the first bridge of Haifang," she murmured, "built to unite the Western Pacts. I remember standing here when they pledged their loyalty. They called it the Binding Bridge." Her voice, usually cold, softened. There was grief beneath it, distant but persistent, like the echo of a wound that had never closed. Anthony leaned against the stone beside her. The faint scent of her hair, cold air and earth after rain, touched him. He watched her fingers slide across the carvings, and for a fleeting moment, he wanted to reach out, to feel the same stone she did, to trace her hand, just to see if the frost of her touch could burn. "You lost all this," he said, his tone neither pitying nor cruel, only factual. She glanced at him then, and he met her gaze. Silver eyes, sharp and endless, like twin moons fixed upon him. "It was stolen," she said. He studied her face in the fading light. "And now you want it back?" Her expression didn't shift. "I want balance. The crown was never the power. It was only the symbol. But they don't understand that anymore. They only remember the fear." Anthony tilted his head. "And you, what do you remember?" Her gaze turned distant again. "The sound of wolves howling in my name. The smell of blood. The warmth of betrayal." He said nothing because there was nothing to say. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, thick with unspoken recognition. Both of them carried ghosts that refused to fade. They made camp by the river that night. The water ran cold and fast, reflecting the first slice of moonlight across its surface. Isara sat near the fire, hair loose and pale against the dark, her cloak fallen to her shoulders. Anthony worked nearby, skin glistening with the heat of the flames as he sharpened his blade. He told himself he wasn't watching her, but his eyes returned to her again and again, drawn to the stillness that clung to her body like armor. When she moved, it was precise, deliberate. She reached into the river to wash the dust from her hands, her skin catching the moonlight like polished glass. Water beaded along her wrist and slid down the inside of her forearm. Anthony looked away, jaw tightening, but the image stayed. The night grew quieter. Wolves in the distance howled, a scattered chorus carried by the wind. Isara tilted her head as if listening to them through the marrow of the world. Her wolf stirred inside her, faint but waking, whispering fragments of instinct she had not heard in centuries. "They do not know you yet, Elira." Her gaze drifted to Anthony. He was sitting across the fire, shoulders broad, head bowed as he cleaned his weapon. His hair fell forward in dark strands that caught the light of the flames. There was a calm brutality to him, the kind of man who could break something beautiful without meaning to. Yet she sensed restraint in him too, a tension held beneath layers of discipline. His power did not frighten her. It called to her like something she had once known but forgotten how to touch. Anthony looked up, sensing her gaze. Their eyes met over the fire. Neither looked away. The flames between them snapped and bent, throwing shifting patterns of gold across their faces. He spoke finally, voice low. "You keep staring at me like you're deciding something." "Perhaps I am. What is it?" "Whether you can be trusted?" He gave a short, humorless breath. "You already know the answer to that." Her lips curved faintly. "I do." He set his blade down, the sound of metal against stone sharp and final. The silence that followed trembled with something neither of them would name. Isara stood walking toward the edge of the camp, the river light sliding over her like quicksilver. Anthony rose without realizing it. He followed, stopping just behind her, close enough that the heat of her body cut through the night air. She didn't move away. The moon had risen fully now, hanging heavy and white above the water. Isara's reflection shimmered on the surface, half woman, half spectral wolf. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. You're not like the others. You don't bow, and you don't fear. Anthony's answer came after a pause. I don't worship what I can bleed. Her eyes turned toward him. And if you bleed first? He stepped closer, his breath brushing the back of her neck. Then I'll bleed looking you in the eye. She didn't turn, didn't step away. But something in her expression softened, a crack in the frost. The air between them thickened, filled with unspoken challenge, and something far more dangerous than threat. Her heart didn't race, but she felt the pulse in her throat quicken, and it was enough to betray her calm. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence said everything. Isara finally walked away, back toward the dying fire, but as she passed him, the edge of her hand brushed his. Barely a touch, almost accidental. His skin burned where it had happened, the mark invisible but impossible to forget. Anthony watched her go, every muscle drawn tight, every instinct on edge. He knew then that whatever she was, whatever she wanted, he was already too close to stop wanting her. And though the night was still, he could swear he heard her wolf's laughter echo faintly in the wind, low and knowing, as if it had been waiting centuries for someone foolish enough to stand this close. Chapter 4. Wolves Who Dream of Crowns. Rain chased them through the hills the next evening, soft at first, then relentless. It flattened Isara's hair to her back and soaked the furs along Anthony's shoulders until they clung like a second skin. Thunder murmured low behind the clouds, never cracking open, as if it too was listening. The trees closed around them as they searched for shelter, limbs knotted high above like the ribs of some great dying beast. Eventually, Anthony found a shallow cave beneath a leaning rock wall, just deep enough to keep the worst of the rain at bay. Isara stepped inside without hesitation, shaking the water from her arms. She didn't flinch at the cold or complain about the damp. Her body moved with the same disciplined stillness that had followed her since the mountain, but something about her tonight felt looser, less sharpened. The damp had softened the edges of her voice the few times she'd spoken, and she moved slower now, as if letting the weight of the world rest briefly on her shoulders. Anthony dropped their packs near the back of the cave, already pulling wood from beneath his coat. Somehow, it was still mostly dry. He didn't ask if she needed warmth. He didn't offer comfort. But when the fire bloomed between them, casting orange against the rock and skin alike, she turned toward it and exhaled like someone remembering what it meant to feel. Her cloak steamed. Her pale arms gleamed in the firelight. Her hair, wet and heavy, curled faintly at the ends. She sat cross-legged, her back straight, one arm resting along her knee. Anthony watched her from across the fire, watched the way the glow lit the underside of her jaw, the curve of her collarbone, the scar across her shoulder, thin and silver like a thread sewn by betrayal. He didn't speak, but the pressure between them built with every breath, thickening the air until it felt like the fire had climbed into his chest. His wolf paced inside him, restless. Rake didn't speak. He hadn't since they left the camp, but his presence was constant, a low growl in the blood. He wasn't sure if it was warning or hunger anymore. Isara didn't look at him, but he knew she was aware of every shift in his breath, every glance that lingered too long. She always was. Outside, the storm crept closer, slow and heavy, drops pounding the stones like whispered drums. The fire cracked. She leaned back on her hands, stretching her legs out toward the heat. Her bare feet were still dirty from the road, the soles toughened from walking without care for comfort. Even that, he found himself watching, how nothing about her was fragile, yet everything about her demanded attention. Without warning, she spoke. The first time I shifted, I tore through my own bones. They said I screamed so loud the sky cracked. Her voice was quiet, but not fragile. She wasn't offering weakness. She was offering memory. He didn't interrupt. I was 13. They called me blessed, then cursed, then holy again when I took my first head in battle. She glanced at him then, her eyes catching the firelight like metal catching sun. Do your people still bleed their wolves before crowning their alphas? Only the ones who need to prove they're more than muscle. He paused. I didn't bleed mine. That made her tilt her head just slightly. A wolf assessing another. And yet they follow you. They follow strength. And you think strength is what I am? He didn't answer, not out loud. But his gaze stayed on her. Hard, steady, full of things he hadn't said because naming them would make them real. She stood without a sound, letting the cloak fall from her shoulders. Her shift began slowly. She didn't convulse. She didn't howl. Her limbs stretched, spine curving, bones reshaping in eerie, beautiful silence. Her wolf was larger than any he'd seen, white as frost, fur slick from the rain. Her eyes remained the same, silver and terrifying. Alira stared at him from the flames, not with hostility but with recognition. Anthony didn't move. Rake surged under his skin, teeth bared, but he held him back. He didn't shift. Not yet. Instead, he stood slowly and walked toward her, stopping just before the fire. Her wolf didn't growl. She merely watched, regal and unyielding. For a long breath, nothing passed between them but heat. Then he knelt. He reached out slowly, resting his hand against the ruff of her neck. Her fur was cold at first, soaked from the storm, but beneath that was warmth. Life. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch. Her eyes never left his. Rake broke free in the next heartbeat. Anthony shifted violently, the way younger wolves often did when instinct overtook control. The sound of bone and muscle, the tearing of skin, the growl that followed. It all echoed through the cave like a promise too old to break. When it was done, two wolves stood in the firelight, one black, jagged, scarred across the snout, one white, perfect, ancient. They circled, no snarling, no threat. A slow, deliberate orbit, and then they moved. Not a fight, not a challenge. A dance. Rake lunged forward, brushing against Alira's shoulder. She darted left, curved around him, her body moving like water. They didn't bite. They didn't clash. They ran, short loops through the cave and back again, paws slapping stone, breath rising in clouds. When they stopped, they stood close enough to touch, and then they did. Alira leaned in, resting her muzzle along Rake's shoulder. It was not submission. It was a statement, a claim, not made of dominance, but of shared recognition. He pressed his body against hers in answer. They remained like that until the fire cracked again. Shifted slowly, returned to flesh and skin, both crouched low by the dying flame. She didn't cover herself. He didn't look away. Her breath was ragged now, but not from exhaustion. Her skin flushed from the shift, hair clinging to her neck, damp and wild. He could see the rhythm of her pulse at the base of her throat. He could feel her heat in the space between them. She reached for her cloak, but her fingers hesitated on the fabric. He caught her wrist. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his fingers slid to the inside of her palm. Slow, deliberate, anchoring the space between them in touch. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either, and instead she whispered, "We're not ready." He released her hand without a word. She turned back toward the fire, the distance between them now full of heat that refused to fade. And behind them, the storm watched in silence, waiting to see who would break first. Chapter 5. The Moonbind. The full moon rose like a blade over the horizon, pale and sharp, washing the forest in silver. The world felt peeled open beneath it, more alive, more alert, as if every root and branch had leaned in to listen. Beneath its light, wolves bled more easily into their truer selves. The night didn't conceal things under a full moon. It revealed them. They had traveled into Moonshard Valley by dusk, a place spoken of in the old bloodlines. Anthony's wolves made camp lower in the hollow, scattered among the trees like silent sentries. But Isara hadn't stayed with them. She had climbed higher and higher until she reached the ridge, The air thin and cold, the ground brittle with frost, the moon almost too close. From here she could see the entire forest stretched beneath her like a map of memories waiting to be redrawn. She stood at the edge of the cliff, cloak pulled tight around her frame, wind dragging at her hair. The hunger inside her had grown sharper in the days since the cave. Not for food, not even for vengeance. It was a deeper ache, buried where instinct slept. The moon pulled at it now, low and slow, like a thread unraveling her from the inside out. She didn't expect him to follow her, but she wasn't surprised when he did. Anthony moved through the trees like something the woods had known for years. Not a man, not quite a beast, something in between, built of night and restraint. When he reached the ridge, he didn't announce himself. He stood beside her, silent, letting the weight of the moment settle without naming it. The silence between them had grown familiar by now, not empty, full of tension, the kind that thickened with every glance, every small brush of breath, every word left unspoken by design. She didn't look at him. Instead, she slipped the cloak from her shoulders and let it fall to the ground. Her skin shone in the moonlight, pale and smooth, catching the chill without flinching. She stepped forward, barefoot onto the moss and cold stone. Her hair trailed behind her like a veil pulled from winter itself. Without a word, she shifted. A lyra exploded from her skin in one smooth breath. No pain, no violence, just transformation. The wolf was massive, white as snowfall, silver eyes glowing faint in the moonlight. She tipped her head back and let the moon fill her lungs. The howl that followed wasn't loud. It was low, controlled, laced with mourning and want and warning. Below, the pack answered. Anthony shifted seconds later, Rake bursting forth with a growl caught in his throat. His black form stood out like ink against snow. He didn't challenge her. He didn't approach immediately. Instead, he circled once, slow and deliberate, letting her see him, feel him, understand him. And then, without warning, they ran. It wasn't a race, it wasn't for dominance, it was something older than both. They wove through trees like wind and shadow, over rock and root, through streams that caught the moonlight in silver sprays. Their bodies brushed once, twice, flanks against flanks, fur against fur, heat against heat, but they never paused. Not until the clearing. Moonlight cut down through a break in the trees, painting the glade in sharp silver. They stopped there, breath coming heavy, paws sinking into damp grass. Elira turned first, her body tense, her head low. Rek mirrored her without hesitation. They circled, closer, slower. She stepped forward, pressing her muzzle against the underside of his jaw. A signal, a test, a line drawn. Rek stilled, then nudged her back with the top of his head, not rough, not soft, but definite. And then they moved as one. It wasn't a mating, not yet. But it was the beginning of something dangerous. Something binding. The way their bodies fit together in stillness, shoulder to shoulder, chest to chest. The way their wolves breathed in sync. They stood like that until the moon dipped lower, and the cold deepened. Then she shifted back. Naked, skin steaming against the frost, she knelt where the wolf had been. Anthony followed, slow and silent, the change rippling through him like water. He crouched across from her, breath heavy, chest bare, hair stuck to his forehead. Their eyes met, no words, only breath. She reached for him. Not fast, not impulsive, but with control, every movement precise. Her hand touched his chest, fingers spreading across the scar that ran beneath his collarbone. He didn't flinch. He let her touch him like a ritual. His hand found her wrist, slid up her arm, paused at her shoulder. The space between them narrowed, air thick with heat, with want, with the quiet scream of restraint. Their mouths nearly met, a heartbeat, a single breath, and then the sound of snapping twigs broke through the clearing. A presence watching. Isara pulled away first, head whipping toward the dark edge of the glade, eyes narrowing. Her scent shifted, no longer soft with instinct, now sharp with alert. Anthony stood, already reaching for the blade tucked in the leather strap he still wore across his thigh. A figure stepped out from the trees, small, familiar. Cora, dripping with rain, eyes wide, hair stuck to her face. She looked between them and said nothing. She didn't need to. The moment was broken. Isara turned away, gathering her cloak, wrapping it around her like armor, her mouth set in a flat line, her eyes hardening back to silver steel. Anthony didn't speak. He watched her walk past him, her bare feet pressing silent into the earth. The wind followed her down the ridge, and the fire between them, once stoked and nearly set loose, was left burning quietly in the dark, unspent. Chapter 6. The Wolf King Shadow. The forest darkened with the scent of blood long before it touched the ground. Isara smelled it in the air. Old blood, stale and bitter, threaded with silver. This was the blood of wolves, spilled by wolves, and it clung to the trees like a warning. The night had not yet fallen, but the light was thin and cold, dragged low by a gathering storm that hadn't yet broken. They moved through the trees in silence, Anthony leading them along the southern trail toward a forgotten outpost nestled in the bones of the valley. Cora rode ahead with one of the scouts, her usual sharpness subdued since the ridge. She had not spoken of what she had seen in the glade, but Isara felt the eyes on her more than before. Curious, guarded, unsure. The moment had passed, but it had not been forgotten. Anthony hadn't touched her since, but he hadn't distanced himself either. He kept near, closer than necessity, his movements subtly orbiting hers, protective, watchful, as if he knew the attack was coming before they did. His wolf had been restless, though Rake said nothing. The silence was worse than growls. It was pressure waiting to break. They reached the clearing by nightfall. The outpost was little more than stone ruins and the ghost of an old campfire ring, but the place stank of fresh trespass, boots, sweat, and blood too recent to be faded. Anthony signaled the others to fan out. Isara stepped forward, nose lifted slightly, eyes narrowing. Then came the howl. Low, crooked, wrong. Not a challenge. A trap. It snapped the tension like a thread pulled too tight. Wolves surged from the trees, blades flashing in the half-dark, snarls ripping through the air. Not rogues, not rival alphas. These wolves wore the black sigil of Thorn, his personal guard, sent ahead like hounds to test the storm before it arrived. Isara shifted without hesitation. Her body blurred into a lyra with a fluid, silent grace that made the charge toward her seem almost foolish. She met the first attacker mid-leap, her jaws closing over his throat before he even saw her eyes. Blood spilled in a hot rush down her chest. Another came from the side. She ducked, whirled, slammed him against the stone with a bone-shaking crack. Anthony shifted seconds later, Reich bursting forward with a growl that sounded like fury incarnate. He tore through one of the black-cloaked wolves with savage efficiency, then lunged at another who dared circle too close to Isara's flank. They fought back-to-back without speaking, moving like pieces of a machine designed for destruction. Her teeth, his claws, her speed, his weight. No gaps, no hesitation. But they were outnumbered. The guard was organized, disciplined, trained to corner and kill with strategy. Isara was fast, but she hadn't fought in this world. Her muscle remembered the wars of the old empire, not the tactics of this one. Lyra growled in frustration as the tempo shifted. Two wolves broke through from the left, cutting her off from Reich. She dodged the first, but the second caught her shoulder. Blood welled in dark rivulets through white fur. Reich saw it, felt it, and something inside him broke. He lunged, reckless, massive, throwing his body into the attacker with no concern for defense. The hit landed hard, enough to drop the wolf instantly, but the moment's opening cost him. Another guard slammed into him from behind, blade sliding deep across his ribs. He howled, loud, raw, not pain, not yet, but the shock of it. Lyra spun, fury blooming white-hot behind her eyes, and she didn't think. She burned. Every muscle in her body surged toward him, claws tearing across moss and stone. She crashed into the wolf that had cut him, teeth snapping into the side of his neck with a sound that silenced the entire glade. The others hesitated, scenting death, scenting something worse. Something older. Her power filled the air like fire fills a cave. It was no longer just strength. It was command. And they fled. The few who survived broke and ran, tails tucked, eyes wide. Some not even shifted fully before they vanished into the trees. The clearing fell into silence, broken only by the harsh pant of Reich's breath and the low, steady growl Aelira gave as she stood over him, blood still dripping from her teeth. Slowly, painfully, Reich shifted back. Anthony collapsed to one knee, hand pressed hard against his ribs. The wound was deep, but not mortal. Not yet. Isara stood in wolf form for a moment longer, panting, trembling, not with fear, but something dangerously close to rage. Then she shifted, body unraveling back into flesh and bone. Her knees hit the ground beside him before the last threads of fur had faded. He looked up at her, eyes dazed from blood loss, but focused on her face with startling clarity. She touched his wound with one hand, pressing cloth to it with precision, but her hand trembled, only slightly. Just enough. He caught her wrist. "You stayed?" he murmured. She didn't answer right away. Her silver eyes met his, cold and brilliant, but no longer unreadable. Her voice was low when it came, like something fragile only she could name. "I didn't think I would." His grip tightened slightly, more instinct than request. Her body was close now, knees brushing his, her hands blood-slick and steady, her breath warm against his throat. The scent of her, blood and cold and wild, curled around him like a second skin. He felt her heart beat through her fingertips. Fast, controlled, not untouched. Her voice dropped lower. "You almost died. So did you." She didn't look away. He didn't let go. For a long breath there was only that, then the sound of footsteps behind them. Cora's voice, low and sharp, calling for medics, breaking the spell like ice cracking underfoot. Isara drew back. Not abruptly, not coldly, but with precision, folding away what had opened between them without letting it close completely. She stood, her body streaked with blood, her posture straight as a blade, eyes still fixed on him. And he knew without being told that she had made a choice, not of surrender, but of place. He wasn't just a tool now, he wasn't just a weapon to wield. He was part of whatever future she was starting to imagine, even if she couldn't name it yet. Chapter 7. The Broken Throne. The ruins of Haifang rose through the morning mist like the bones of some long-dead beast, half buried beneath creeping ivy and centuries of silence. Stones that had once carried the weight of empire were now split open by roots. Statues of wolves with hollowed eyes leaned crookedly in their decay, crowns cracked, paws chipped, their glory worn thin by wind and memory. There was no ceremony in their arrival. No procession. Just the quiet hush of footfalls across forgotten ground. Isara stood before the shattered archway that had once framed the throne room of her rule. Her shoulders were squared, her expression unreadable, but Anthony saw it. The pause in her breath, the way her fingers brushed the broken stone as she stepped through. She didn't slow. She didn't ask for solitude. She moved through the wreckage like a shadow haunting its own home. Anthony followed a step behind, silent, watchful, letting the weight of this place settle into his chest. There was something unnerving about seeing her here, surrounded by the remnants of her past. The sharp, commanding woman he had come to know looked smaller somehow in the presence of these ruins, not weaker, but pulled back into something older, more deeply wound. The air inside the throne hall was colder than the outside, still and preserved, as if the room itself remembered too much. Moonlight cut through a jagged gap in the ceiling, illuminating the stone seat at the end of the room. It was cracked down the middle, one arm missing, vines curling up the side like green veins through dead stone. Isara stopped in front of it. She stared at the broken throne for a long time without speaking, her face unreadable, her body unmoving. The silence stretched. Anthony waited, When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it held none of the fragility of grief. It was a voice shaped by fire, not sorrow. My sister sat there after they dragged my body from the floor. I bled out where you're standing now. Her eyes didn't leave the throne. She wept while she crowned herself, not for me, for the guilt. She thought it made her noble. Anthony stepped forward slowly, the sound of his boots soft against the stone. He stopped just behind her, close enough to feel her stillness, but he didn't speak. This wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a reckoning. Isara moved toward the throne and placed her hand on the back of it, fingers curling along the crack in the stone. Her bare skin looked pale against the cold gray, almost translucent, as if the years beneath the ice had never fully let her go. I thought I would want it back, she said, almost to herself. The crown? The hall? The power? Her hand dropped from the throne. But now that I'm here, I realize it was never mine to keep. None of it ever was. Anthony didn't answer, but the shift in her tone stirred something inside him. This wasn't surrender. It was something else. Clarity. She wasn't grieving a loss. She was choosing not to reclaim what had been stolen. He moved to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that the warmth of his body cut the chill in the air. She looked at him then, her expression unreadable but not closed. There was a question in her eyes, though she hadn't spoken it aloud. He didn't try to answer it. Instead, he looked at the throne, then back at her. "You're not the woman who died here," he said at last, "and the world doesn't need her back. It needs what's standing in front of me now." She didn't look away. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, or maybe hadn't let herself see. Not reverence, not lust. Something deeper, something far more dangerous than desire. She turned to face him fully, the throne behind her, moonlight falling across her bare shoulders. The air between them shifted, thickened, as though the very walls were holding their breath. He didn't reach for her, not yet. But his eyes were fixed on her mouth, his jaw set like he was holding something in. She stepped toward him, closing the distance slowly, deliberately, her bare feet silent against the stone. When she was close enough that she could feel the heat rising from his skin, she stopped. Her hand lifted, fingertips brushing along the scar at his side, just above where he'd taken the blade meant for her days ago. The skin there was still healing, the flesh still tender beneath her touch. He inhaled, a slow breath, not sharp, not startled, just steady. His hands stayed at his sides, but his body leaned toward hers with the gravity of someone barely holding himself back. "You should have let me fight alone," she said softly, her finger still tracing the edge of the wound. "You didn't," he replied. Her eyes rose to his, the silver catching the light, bright and watchful. His gaze didn't falter. She stepped in again, and this time their bodies brushed. Barely. Just enough to make his breath hitch. Her hand moved from his side to his chest, sliding up to rest just over his heart. His skin was warm beneath her touch, and the beat there was steady, but heavier than before. Still, he didn't move. She could feel his restraint, could taste the tension in the space between them, and it ignited something in her that had nothing to do with power, and everything to do with choice. Her mouth was close to his now, close enough that her breath touched his lips when she spoke. "Tell me to stop." He didn't. His hands lifted finally, sliding to her waist with slow, reverent pressure, holding her like something he didn't trust the world not to take. His mouth hovered just above hers, not kissing, just breathing with her, through her, like he was memorizing the feel of her in this exact moment. Then the air changed. The old mind link shattered in her skull like glass. She staggered back a step, pressing a hand to her temple as the noise poured in. Dozens of voices, layered and snarling. Not her pack, not her wolves. It was Thorn. His voice, sharp and cruel, had reached across the bond that should have died with her bloodline. He knew she was here, Anthony caught her before she fell, arm strong and sure, holding her steady as she clenched her teeth against the pain. Her breath came fast now, not from arousal, but from rage. His voice was low, steady in her ear. What just happened? She opened her eyes, silver blazing. He felt me, she said. The king knows I'm alive. She stepped back from him, not out of distance, but necessity. The moment between them fractured but not broken. The tension didn't fade. It shifted, sharpened, fed by urgency now, by the knowledge that time had run out. The king's shadow had reached the ruins, but the fire between them was still burning. Chapter 8. Bonded by fire. They didn't speak as they left the ruins behind, and yet every breath carried the weight of what had passed between them. The shattered throne had been a reminder of what she had lost, but it was the look in Anthony's eyes, something unspoken, something unfinished, that Isara carried with her as they returned to the edge of the woods. Night fell without ceremony. No songs, no howls, no warnings. Only the steady hum of the forest and the lingering heat in her chest that would not cool. The camp had been set beyond the ruins, just beyond the ridge where pine trees thickened and the sky opened above the valley. The wolves settled in quickly, guards rotating watch, others resting in makeshift shelters. But Isara did not sleep. She found a place near the fire, not too close, not too far, where the light touched her face and the shadows gathered around her shoulders like a second cloak. Her body ached, not from battle, but from restraint, the kind that stretched under skin and refused to break. Anthony stood across from her, sharpening a blade with a patience that felt more like distraction than necessity. The sparks that leapt from the edge of the stone glinted in his eyes, gold catching gold. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing arms scored with old wounds. She could see the slow rhythm of his breath, the flicker in his jaw every time his gaze drifted toward her, and he pulled it back again. The fire between them was not just made of wood. She stood without a word and walked toward him, her steps silent, deliberate. He didn't flinch when she stopped in front of him, nor when she reached out and took the blade from his hand. She placed it gently on the ground beside them, her touch light but final. His eyes lifted to hers, steady, unreadable. But beneath the calm was tension, unrelieved and dangerously ripe. Her hands moved first, slow, careful. She touched the line of his shoulder, traced the curve of his collarbone, and then pressed her palm to his chest, where his heartbeat thudded, heavy and hard. He exhaled slowly. Still, he did not reach for her, so she closed the space. There was no asking, there was no question. There was only the fire, and the ache, and the unbearable stretch of time between glances, between thoughts, between the touch that hadn't yet happened, and the one that finally did. When her mouth met his, it was not soft, it was not sweet, it was necessary. Their bodies moved with hunger, not violence. She pushed him back until his spine met the tree behind him, and he caught her waist with both hands, firm and grounding. The taste of him was sharp, salt and smoke and something darker. His hands slid along her back, tracing the curve of muscle, the dip of her spine, the edge of her control. She felt him tremble when she sank her fingers into his hair. Not with fear, with restraint. It made her bolder. Their wolves stirred beneath the skin, silent but watching, not urging, not interfering, just witnessing. His mouth moved along her neck, slow, reverent, lingering where her pulse beat fastest. Her breath caught, but she did not pull away. She tilted her head, offering more. Clothing came apart between them with the kind of quiet that only made the tension worse. No tearing, no rush, just the slow unfurling of barriers long overstayed. Every inch of skin revealed was earned. Every breath deepened the gravity between them. The fire crackled nearby, casting shadows along their bodies, highlighting the flex of muscle, the stretch of her throat, the arch of his chest against hers. She touched him like she was remembering something, not discovering it. He held her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. And still they did not speak. Words would have ruined it. What passed between them was not ceremony. It was not submission. It was not the mating bond. Not yet. But it was close. Close enough to taste. When she slid against him, her body fit like it had always known his. His mouth found hers again. This time, slower, deeper, and for a long moment, they simply breathed together. Skin against skin. Thought against thought. The wolves beneath their flesh howled low inside their chests, not out loud, but in the places only they could feel. And in that silence something shifted. Not the bond, not the final tie, but the first true surrender. Not of power, of trust, of choosing to be near, not because fate commanded it, but because they wanted to. When it was over, they stayed close, not tangled, not clinging, just near, her head against his shoulder, his hand curled around her thigh. No one moved to leave first. He traced small circles along her back with his fingers. She closed her eyes. The fire faded low, the air cooling, the night settling around them like a secret. But neither of them slept. Not because of danger, because they were still listening to the echo of what they hadn't dared say. And both of them knew that when morning came, everything would burn brighter. And darker, for what they had allowed to begin. But for now, under the hush of trees and the ghost light of stars, they remained, bonded by fire. Chapter 9. The Challenge. The capital lay like a wound beneath the haze of morning. No snow reached it. No wind stirred the air. Only stone and shadow. Sharp angles rising from black rock, where the new king's mark had been carved deep into every gate and pillar. Haifang no longer howled here. It had been silenced by the iron rain of thorn. But Isara felt the pulse of the old blood anyway, a rhythm beneath her feet that still remembered her. They crossed the outer ridge at dawn, silence thick between the two of them, not from distance, but from understanding. Words were no longer necessary. What had passed between them in the dark, beneath the fire, had shifted something fundamental. She moved beside Anthony now, not as an artifact from another age, not as a weapon waiting to be unsheathed, but as his equal, unbound, unclaimed, but chosen. And still the bond hung unsealed between them, close enough to touch, just out of reach. He glanced at her as they descended toward the outer gate. His expression was unreadable, jaw tight, golden eyes hard. But she felt the weight of his attention even when he looked away. It was not possessiveness. It was readiness. She wore no crown, no armor, only black cloth wound tight to her body, her hair braided back, her scar bared at the shoulder like a signature written in blood. She walked without ceremony into the city, and the wolves who saw her turned their heads slowly, some blinking as if waking from a long, forgotten dream. She didn't acknowledge them. She only walked forward. Anthony moved at her side, the sigil of his pack burned into the leather across his chest. Though it mattered little here. Thorn City belonged to no one but Thorn. Until now. The challenge had already been issued. By the time they reached the arena, the stands had begun to fill. Wolves, high-ranking alphas, minor nobles, enforcers, and loyalists, all called to witness what they thought would be another crushing defeat beneath the feet of a king. Isara stood in the shadows, unseen. She was not part of the challenge. Not officially. She let them believe it. The arena floor was black stone, scorched by years of battles staged for blood rather than honor. Anthony stepped into the ring first. Alone. Thorn waited at the far end, robed in dark red, a crown of bone resting heavy across his brow. His smile was smug, his eyes cold. He looked younger than she remembered. Stronger, too. Time had sharpened him, not dulled. Anthony didn't flinch. He moved like he had nothing to prove, which made the king's smirk falter. Isara stood just beyond the edge of the ring, cloaked in shadow, her arms crossed, body still. She said nothing, did nothing, until Thorn's eyes caught hers. The moment stretched. Recognition struck him like a slap. She saw it, and his body stiffened, the blood drained from his face, not completely, but enough to strip away the smug mask. She gave him nothing, no smile, no greeting, just silence. He turned away from her with a jerk. The challenge began. Anthony moved first, not with aggression but precision. Every strike was calculated, every dodge deliberate. Thorn fought like someone who believed he could not be defeated. Anthony fought like someone who refused to lose, and it was brutal, sharp and swift. Flesh tore. Blood hit stone. The crowd grew louder, but Isara's focus narrowed. Not on Anthony's strength. Not even on Thorn's strategy. She watched their wolves. The way rake flared beneath Anthony's skin, held back only by sheer control. The way Thorn's beast pushed out like a curse, bloated and wrong, like something twisted from old blood. It wasn't just a battle, it was a corruption. Anthony landed a blow to Thorn's side that made the king stagger, breath hissing through clenched teeth. The arena quieted, and Isara stepped forward. No one called her name. No one announced her. But the ground shifted anyway. Her presence filled the space between breaths, between beats, between thoughts. She moved through the ring, like a storm rolling down from the old mountains. Thorn froze mid-motion. "You're dead," he hissed, blood on his teeth. "I was," she answered. She walked to Anthony's side, close enough to feel the blood running down his ribs. Her eyes didn't leave Thorn's. "I'm not here for your throne. You expect them to believe that?" She smiled, but it was not kind. "They don't need to." She looked at Anthony then, and in that glance, something passed between them. Full, silent, inevitable. Their wolves rose together. The bond pulsed between them, fierce and hungry. She didn't move first, he did. He reached for her wrist, the same hand she'd used to press against his chest that night under the fire. His fingers wrapped around her skin. Her body leaned into his. The crowd gasped, not from the contact but from the way the air cracked. The mating bond flared like lightning, not soft, not golden, not romantic. Wild, hot, old. It snapped into place with a sound like bone-breaking. Alira and Rak howled as one, not in pain, not in submission, but in the raw fury of completion. The bond didn't settle, it stormed. Thorn took a step back. Too late. Anthony shifted mid-stride, leaping across the ring. Rak landed on Thorn with a crash, teeth finding flesh, claws raking deep. Isara shifted beside him, Alira gleaming white and furious, her roar rising with his. They fought together. They finished it together. And when the dust settled, the king's crown lay broken in the dirt. No one moved and no one cheered. They simply stared at her. At them. At what had been forged. Not in ceremony, not in bloodline, but in fire and battle and choice. Anthony looked at her, still in wolf form, and she met his gaze with quiet certainty. Not ruled, not owned, but bound, not to an empire, to each other. Chapter 10. The Queen Who Chose. The city held its breath in the days that followed. The blood of the false king had dried beneath the black stone of the arena, but no one had dared to wipe it away. It remained there like a mark carved into memory, as permanent as the heat still pulsing through the air every time she walked past. Isara did not take the throne. She stood in the ruins of the palace, looked once at the jagged bones of her past, then turned away. The crown had been left where it fell beside Thorn's body. She hadn't touched it. Not even once. The wolves waited for her to rule, to declare herself Empress Reborn, to take back what had been stolen. But she gave them only silence. And silence, for the first time in centuries, was louder than power. They followed her anyway. Anthony watched her from the shadowed edge of the ruined courtyard as she moved across the stone. Quiet, slow, distant in a way that had nothing to do with him. She had bathed in the river that morning. Her hair was still damp, a silver line along the curve of her back beneath her dark wrap. Her bare arms caught the last rays of sunlight as it dipped low behind the cliffs. She didn't notice him watching, or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. The bond between them pulsed low and steady now, no longer roaring through his blood, but not silent either. It settled in the space between breath and thought, always present, always waiting. When she turned, she didn't speak, but her eyes held him fast. He crossed the distance slowly. She didn't move until he was standing in front of her, close enough that he could feel the whisper of her breath against his skin. The tension between them was different now, no longer sharp with denial, or edged by uncertainty. It had matured into something deeper, quieter, more dangerous. It held promise and fire, and restraint, stretched so thin it might snap with a single touch. She didn't ask him why he'd come, and he didn't ask what she needed, and instead she reached up, her fingers sliding along the line of his jaw, rough with stubble, warm from the sun. He closed his eyes under her touch. She took his hand, slow, deliberate, and pulled him with her. They crossed the hall of broken marble and entered what had once been the Queen's private chamber, now a ruin draped in vines and moonlight. The walls had collapsed in one corner, the open sky casting a pale glow through the shattered ceiling. Moss crept over the stone floor. Time had eroded everything except the silence. She let go of his hand at the center of the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She untied the wrap at her shoulders, letting the cloth fall in one smooth motion to the floor. Her body was pale and strong beneath the moonlight, lit from above like she had been carved from the sky itself. Scars traced her ribs, one along her thigh, the faintest one near her hip. She stood still, unashamed, untouched by anything but the weight of choice. He undressed slowly, not because he was hesitant, but because this wasn't about urgency. It was reverence. Every movement carried intent. He stripped away the armor, the leather, the shirt clinging to his blood-marked skin. When he stepped to her, their bodies brushed without collision. Just a breath. Just the press of skin against skin, chest to chest, warmth to warmth. She leaned into him then, not roughly but fully, her mouth finding his in the quietest way. No rush. No gasp. Just pressure. Soft. Controlled. Her hand slid along his neck, fingers into his hair, and she deepened the kiss until it stopped being a kiss and started becoming something else. He lowered her to the moss-covered floor with care, not because she was fragile, but because the moment wasn't. His hands explored her without demand, her ribs, her waist, the curve of her spine. Her body opened to him like a memory long denied, heat blooming along every inch of skin he touched. She guided him without words. She didn't need to tell him where. Her breath, her body, the arch of her hips, everything answered for her. His lips traced her collarbone, then lower, lingering in the hollow of her throat where her pulse beat fast, steady, alive. When they came together, it was not sharp. It was slow, deep, drawn out like a secret that had taken too long to be told. The rhythm was not hurried. Their bodies moved like they'd done this before in another life. A memory slipping back into place. His mouth found hers again, silencing the soft sounds she made, until her fingers curled hard into his shoulders and her breath caught in her chest. The moon broke through the clouds, light spilled across their skin, and still they moved, slow, then slower, like they were trying to stretch this single moment into something endless. He held her after, not possessive, just close. Their limbs tangled without thought, warmth shared without words. Her hand rested over his heart, his fingers in her hair. Neither of them moved. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It was peace. She didn't speak until the wind stirred through the broken ceiling, brushing cool air across their skin. She lifted her head from his chest, looked at him with eyes that no longer carried the weight of a throne, only the clarity of a choice made freely. "We begin again," she whispered. He nodded once, not as her alpha, not as her warrior, but as the man she had let in. Not a bond forged in battle, not a kingdom claimed in blood, but a queen who had chosen, and the wolf who had dared to stand at her side.